I always believed love was something you built, not just a feeling that magically appeared but something you had to work for, nurture, and protect. That's the kind of love I thought I shared with Anne. From the moment we met, everything between us felt effortless, like we just fit. She had this magnetic presence, a kind of charm that could brighten any room, making everyone around her feel more at ease. I was no exception. I first crossed paths with Anne when I was 28, a few years into my career. She was 26, fresh out of school, already carving out her place as an interior designer. What drew me in right away was her confidence. She had an eye for detail, and this incredible ability to make even the most ordinary things feel special. It didn't take long for me to fall for her, and within 2 years, we were married. Together, we built a life I believed was grounded in love and stability. I worked in finance, climbing the corporate ladder, putting in long hours to secure the future I envisioned for us. And on the other hand, poured her heart into her passion, designing beautiful spaces. She took on projects that excited her, transforming homes and businesses with her talent. It was more than just a job for her. It was something that truly lit her up, and I loved seeing that spark whenever she talked about her work. Our home was like an extension of Anne herself, elegant, thoughtfully curated, and full of life. Every room reflected her creativity, every corner arranged with purpose. She had carefully selected everything, from the color of the walls to the furniture that filled the space. It wasn't just a house, it was the life we had built together. Financially, we were comfortable. I wasn't wealthy, but I earned enough for us to enjoy a good life. We traveled occasionally, treated ourselves to nice dinners, and indulged in small luxuries when we could. And never had to stress about money, and that gave me a deep sense of pride. I wanted to be the kind of husband who provided, who made sure she never felt like she was missing out. Like any marriage, ours had its ups and downs. We'd bicker over little things, whose turn it was to do the dishes, why she spent so much time on her phone, why I worked late so often. But no matter how tense things got, we always seemed to find our way back to each other, or at least, that's what I believed. Looking back, those years felt like some of the happiest of my life. I truly believe we were building something solid, something that would stand the test of time. It never crossed my mind that anything could break it. If you'd asked me back then what made our marriage work, I would have given a simple answer: balance. Anne and I complemented each other in ways that made life feel almost effortless. She was the dreamer, the one who could transform an empty space into something beautiful. I was the planner, the one making sure we could actually afford the life we wanted. Together, we created something that felt real, something I thought was unshakable. Our routines were well established. I usually woke up early for work, slipping out before Anne even stirred. She wasn't a morning person, so I always set the coffee machine the night before, knowing she'd appreciate waking up to a fresh pot. It was a small gesture, one of many I did simply because I loved her. Evenings were our time. No matter how hectic the day had been, I made it a point to be home for dinner whenever I could. Sometimes Anne would surprise me with a new recipe she'd stumbled across online. Other nights, we'd grab takeout and curl up on the couch, watching whatever show had us hooked at the moment. It wasn't extravagant, but it was ours, and that made it perfect. Weekends were a blend of relaxation and social outings. And loved brunches with friends, browsing art galleries, and hunting for design inspiration. I didn't always get her excitement over furniture styles and color palettes, but I enjoyed watching her light up when she talked about them. Whenever I had the time, I'd tag along, but just as often, I'd stay back, catching up on work or tackling projects around the house. We were never the kind of couple who needed to be together every second of the day. We had our own interests, our own little worlds, but they always seemed to run side by side and eventually circle back to each other. I took that as a sign of a strong marriage, two independent people continually choosing each other. Of course, there were moments of friction. And sometimes grew frustrated with my long hours, saying it felt like work always came first. From my side, I felt the weight of being the provider, the one responsible for turning our shared dreams into reality. I always believed she understood that, even when she sighed as I answered emails late at night or took work calls during dinner. But through it all, I never once doubted her love. Even in the quiet moments, when we weren't saying much, there was comfort in simply knowing she was there. I had no clue that, beneath the surface, something was already shifting, that the life we'd built, the routines we'd settled into, were starting to crack. Looking back, I wonder when those first cracks actually appeared. At the time, they were easy to brush off, small, insignificant moments that seemed like nothing more than the usual ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. I always believed we were building something solid, something built to last forever. It never once crossed my mind that anything could break it. If someone had asked me back then what made our marriage strong, I would have given a simple answer: balance. And then I complimented each other in ways that made life feel easy. She was the dreamer, the one who could turn an empty room into something beautiful, while I was the planner, the one making sure we could actually afford the life we wanted. Together, we created something that felt real, something I thought nothing could shake. Our routines fit together like pieces of a puzzle. I'd wake up early for work, usually slipping out before an even stirred. She was never much of a morning person, so I made it a habit to set the coffee machine the night before, knowing she'd appreciate waking up to the smell of fresh coffee. It was a small thing, but it was one of the many little gestures I did simply because I loved her. Evenings were our time. No matter how hectic the day had been, I always tried to be home for dinner. Sometimes and would cook, surprising me with a new recipe she'd found online. Other nights, we'd just order takeout and curl up on the couch, watching whatever show had us hooked at the moment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. Weekends were a mix of relaxation and social outings. And loved brunch with friends, wandering through art galleries, and shopping for design inspiration. I didn't always understand her excitement over furniture styles or color palettes, but I enjoyed watching her light up when she talked about them. Whenever I could, I'd tag along, but just as often, I'd stay back, catching up on work or tackling things around the house. We were never the kind of couple who needed to be together every second of the day. We had our own interests, our own lives, but they always seemed to run side by side, eventually circling back to each other. I saw that as a sign of a strong marriage, two independent people choosing each other, day after day. Of course, it wasn't perfect. And sometimes resented how much time I spent working, saying it felt like I was putting my job ahead of us. From my perspective, I was just trying to provide, to make sure we had the future we'd always talked about. I truly believed she understood that, even when she sighed as I answered emails during dinner or took late-night work calls. But through it all, I never doubted her love. Even in the quiet moments, when neither of us was saying much, there was comfort in simply knowing she was there. I had no idea that, beneath the surface, something was already shifting, that the life we'd built, the routines we'd fallen into, were starting to crack. Looking back, I can't help but wonder when the first cracks really began to form. At the time, they were easy to overlook, small, forgettable moments that felt like nothing more than the usual ups and downs of a long-term relationship. But now, with the clarity that hindsight brings, I can see those moments for what they really were, warnings. And had always been affectionate, though not in an overly clingy way. She showed love through small gestures, running her fingers through my hair while we watched TV, resting her hand on my leg during car rides, or sending me quick texts in the middle of the day just to check in. I didn't notice it right away, but those little moments started to fade. At first, I chalked it up to stress. She'd recently taken on more high-end clients, projects that demanded long hours and drained her energy. Some days, she'd come home completely worn out, barely saying a word before disappearing into a long bath or mindlessly scrolling through her phone. It made sense. I'd been there myself, so caught up in work that everything else faded into the background. I told myself she just needed space, that things would balance out again like they always did. But then came the other changes, the ones that weren't so easy to brush off. And started dressing differently. She'd always had a good sense of style, but now she was putting more thought into her appearance before stepping out the door. She bought new clothes, pieces that flattered her figure in ways she never seemed to care about before. She spent extra time in front of the mirror, fixing her hair, adjusting her outfits until they were just right. I joked with her once, asking if she had a secret modeling gig I didn't know about. She just laughed and said, "I just want to feel good about myself." I didn't think much of it at the time. Then came the late nights. It started with the occasional client dinner or a meeting that stretched longer than expected. But gradually, those nights became more frequent. She'd come home later and later, sometimes well past midnight, with vague explanations that didn't entirely make sense. I got caught up talking with a client. We decided to grab drinks after the meeting. You know how these projects are, they just demand extra time sometimes. I wanted to believe her. Why wouldn't I? She'd never given me a reason to doubt her before. So I convinced myself it was just work, just a busy season. Things would settle down eventually. She'd come back to me when the dust cleared. At first, it seemed harmless, almost funny. She'd spray that new perfume, the one she said she was saving for special occasions, even when she was just heading out for a casual drink or a late client meeting. I teased her about it once, joking that she must have picked up a secret modeling gig she hadn't told me about. She laughed, kissed my cheek, and called me ridiculous. But it didn't feel ridiculous. It felt off, like she was preparing herself for something. Or someone. Then came the nights she'd slip into bed without a word, long after I'd given up waiting. The faint smell of perfume and alcohol clung to her, but there was something else, too, something I couldn't quite name. When I reached for her, she'd pull away, mumbling about being exhausted. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the distance between us stretch wider, like a canyon I couldn't cross. I wanted to believe it was just a phase, that she was overwhelmed, stressed, maybe going through something she hadn't figured out how to talk about. But deep down, I knew better. The confirmation came when I wasn't even looking for it. One night, she left her laptop open on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower. I was just passing by, grabbing a glass of water, not thinking about anything in particular, when a message notification popped up on the screen. Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about you. My breath caught in my throat. The contact name was just a random string of initials, nothing recognizable. Before I could process it, the screen dimmed and faded to black, like the universe itself was trying to hide the truth from me. My stomach dropped. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in from all sides. I stood there, frozen, staring at the laptop like if I blinked, the message would rewrite itself into something innocent. But it didn't. I told myself it had to be a misunderstanding. Maybe it was an old message. Maybe it wasn't even meant for her. Maybe. No. No more excuses. I didn't say anything that night. I wanted to, the words burned in my throat, demanding to be spoken, but I couldn't. Not yet. A single message wasn't enough to destroy everything. I needed to be sure before I confronted her. Before I shattered whatever fragile illusions still held our life together. So I waited. And I watched. And what I saw made my blood run cold. She changed her phone's passcode. Her phone, once casually left on the counter or nightstand, was now glued to her hand or tucked away in her purse. When she thought I wasn't looking, she'd smile at the screen, fingers flying over the keyboard before she quickly locked it again. She started staying up later, claiming she needed to unwind after long days. But even after I went to bed, I could see the soft glow of her phone reflecting in her face as she sat on the couch, eyes locked on whatever conversation was keeping her so engaged. Then came the night I heard her whispering in the bathroom. It was past midnight. I'd been drifting in and out of sleep when the sliver of light under the door caught my eye. I sat up, blinking away the haze of sleep, and strained to hear. Her voice was low, soft, intimate. I slid out of bed, moving quietly across the floor. Standing just outside the bathroom, I held my breath, heart pounding in my chest. "I miss you too." 4 words. Quiet, almost tender. But they hit me like a punch to the gut. I stood there, fists clenched at my sides, mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe it was a friend, a colleague, someone venting about life, work, anything but what it sounded like. But there was no denying it anymore. And was cheating on me. I didn't know who it was. Not yet. But I'd find out. And when I did, there'd be no coming back from it. Something shifted inside me that night, standing outside the bathroom door, hearing those whispered words. "I miss you too." It wasn't just the betrayal itself. It was the gut-wrenching realization that the life I'd built, the love I'd poured into this marriage, had been reduced to a lie. I wanted to storm in, to demand answers, to force her to admit what she'd done. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I walked back to bed, lay down, and stared at the ceiling. My heart pounded against my ribs, my mind spinning through every interaction, every moment from the past few months that now made horrifying sense. The late nights. The secrecy. The shift in her behavior. The message on her laptop. The way she'd pulled away from me, her husband, while whispering to someone else in the dead of night. Some stranger now held the intimacy that had once belonged to me. But suspicion wasn't enough. I needed proof. The next day, I started paying closer attention. I didn't ask questions. I didn't press her for details. I didn't let her see that anything had changed. I just watched. When she got home from work, I noticed how she kept her phone angled away from me, how she swiped away notifications the second they appeared. When she left for evening meetings, I checked the time, tracking how long she was gone and trying to piece together where she might be. I took mental notes. Patterns. When she left. When she came back. What excuse she gave. I checked our shared calendar on her laptop, hoping for something, anything, that might give me a clue. But there was nothing concrete. Just gaps. Just absences, filled with vague explanations. I needed something more. Something undeniable. So, I did what I never thought I'd do. One night, while she was in the shower, I took her phone. My hands were shaking as I typed in the passcode, praying I'd guess right, mind racing with the fear that she might step out and catch me at any second. I'd never done anything like this before, never even considered it. But when someone shows you who they truly are, you stop playing by the rules. The first thing I noticed was how empty everything looked. No messages. Not a single text. No long conversations with friends, coworkers, nothing. It was too clean. Too perfect. My stomach twisted. And had deleted them. But why erase messages if there was nothing to hide? I opened her call history. Same thing. Blank. My breathing grew shallow. And had never been overly cautious with her phone before. She'd always been the type to leave notifications piling up, barely remembering to clear her inbox. But now it was spotless. She was covering her tracks. Desperate for answers, I checked her recent apps. One stood out immediately, an encrypted messaging app I'd never seen before. My heart pounded as I tapped it. Passcode required. Dead end. I stood there for a moment, the soft sound of the shower running in the background, the phone heavy in my hand. This was it. The proof I'd been searching for. But proof wasn't enough. I didn't just want a confession. I wanted to watch the truth unravel in front of me, to see her crumble under the weight of undeniable evidence. I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it, and walked out of the bedroom, heart hammering in my chest. My mind screamed at me. Confront her. Now. End this. But another part of me, the part drowning in betrayal and anger, held me back. That night, lying beside her in the dark, I made a decision. If and thought she could hide this from me, she was wrong. I'd find out everything. And when I did, she wouldn't see it coming. The hardest part about suspicion is how it poisons everything. Once the thought of betrayal takes root, it spreads like rot. Every look, every word, every gesture starts to feel like a clue, a thread begging to be pulled. Yet, despite the weight of doubt pressing down on me, I hesitated. Because confronting her meant facing the truth. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. But the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. And had grown more distant, though she tried to disguise it. She still greeted me when I got home, still smiled when we spoke. But it felt practiced. Forced. Like she was playing the role of a devoted wife rather than actually being one. We'd sit on the couch like we always had, but she didn't curl up beside me anymore. When I reached for her hand, she'd let me take it, but she never held on. Our conversations had turned hollow. Polite. Surface level. Like strangers making small talk. And the late nights? They only grew more frequent. Each excuse thinner than the last. She talked about work in vague terms, throwing in just enough detail to make her stories sound plausible. But I wasn't buying it. Not anymore. She never gave me enough details to piece together a full picture. Whenever I asked how her meetings had gone, she would brush me off with vague responses. It was fine. Or, nothing exciting. If I pushed for more, she would let out an exasperated sigh and steer the conversation elsewhere, as if my curiosity was irritating rather than a natural concern of a husband who simply wanted to stay connected to his wife. And then there was her phone. I had always been the kind of person who valued and respected privacy. In all the years we had been together, not once had I felt the need to check her messages or question who she was talking to. But lately, that trust had started to erode. I found myself watching her more closely whenever she picked up her phone, noticing the subtle ways she kept the screen angled away from me, the ways she would silence notifications whenever we were in the same room. Sometimes, she would read something that made her smile, a soft, private expression that I hadn't seen directed at me in what felt like forever. And just as quickly as that fleeting moment of warmth appeared, it would vanish, replaced by an almost calculated indifference. I kept telling myself I was overthinking it, that I was letting my fears run wild and create problems where none actually existed. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it, that gnawing sense of unease growing stronger with each passing day. Then came the night I finally made up my mind. As I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling in the dark, I realized I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in uncertainty, drowning in doubt, feeling like an outsider in my own marriage. I needed answers. So, the next morning, while Anne was in the shower, I made a decision. My hands trembled as I opened her laptop, my heart hammering against my ribs. I hesitated for a moment, hovering over the keyboard, half hoping I would find nothing at all, half expecting to uncover everything. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Her emails were normal, no suspicious messages, no hidden conversations, nothing that screamed betrayal. For a brief second, I felt a rush of relief, almost laughing at myself for how ridiculous I had been acting. But just as I was about to close the screen, something caught my eye: her browsing history. She had been searching for hotels. Expensive ones. A cold knot formed in my stomach as I clicked through the links, scanning the pages she had visited. Some were right here in our city, others were a few hours away. Some had only been checked once, while others had been visited multiple times. There were no reservations, no confirmation emails, nothing concrete. But that didn't matter. What mattered was why. My mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe she was planning a surprise getaway for us, an attempt to mend whatever had been unraveling between us. Maybe she had a client who needed recommendations. Maybe. I stopped myself. No. No more excuses. I closed the laptop and sat there, gripping the edge of the desk as my thoughts spiraled. If she was planning something for us, why wouldn't she mention it? And if it wasn't for us, then who was it for? I didn't have the answer yet. But I was getting closer. And I knew that soon enough, the truth would reveal itself, whether I was ready for it or not. I no longer had to dig for the truth. It was about to present itself in a way I never could have anticipated. The growing distance between us was no longer something I could push to the back of my mind. It wasn't just in the way Anne subtly recoiled from my touch or how she barely met my gaze when we spoke. It was in the silence, the heavy, suffocating quiet that had seeped into every corner of our lives. Our conversations had dwindled down to empty exchanges, mechanical and devoid of warmth, as if we were nothing more than two strangers coexisting under the same roof instead of a married couple who had once been inseparable. She still smiled at me, still said all the right things, but her words felt hollow, like lines from a script, rehearsed and carefully delivered to keep up an illusion. But I wasn't buying it. I could sense the truth lurking beneath the surface. I saw it in the way she no longer laughed at my jokes, in the way she took longer to respond when I spoke, in the way her thoughts seemed to drift elsewhere even when we were sitting in the same room. I tried to convince myself it was just stress, that maybe work had been weighing on her, that this was just a rough patch. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted. Something was off. It was the small details that betrayed her, the subtle yet telling changes. She started leaving earlier in the mornings and coming home later at night, her excuses growing thinner each time. She became overly protective of her phone, keeping it glued to her hand or flipped face down on every surface. And then, there was the lingerie, delicate, lacy pieces I had never seen her wear for me. At first, I refused to let my mind go there. I didn't want to be that husband, the paranoid one who jumped to conclusions, convinced his wife was cheating just because she had become distant. But the weight in my chest grew heavier with each passing day. Eventually, it wasn't just a nagging suspicion anymore. It was a certainty, one I couldn't ignore. One evening, as she prepared for yet another so-called business dinner, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching her. She stood before the mirror, adjusting the thin straps of a sleek black dress, one I had never seen before. It hugged her curves perfectly, elegant yet undeniably meant to turn heads. She reached for a bottle of perfume, the one she reserved only for special occasions. "You've been working late a lot these days," I said, keeping my voice steady, measured. I kept my voice as casual as possible, and barely hesitated as she fastened her earrings. "Yeah, it's been a busy season. Clients are demanding as hell," she said smoothly. I nodded, forcing a small smile. "Where's the dinner?" She grabbed her purse, glanced at her phone, and answered, "That French place downtown, the one with the overpriced wine list." I kept my expression neutral, even though I already knew she was lying. Earlier that day, I had checked her browsing history. There were no restaurant searches, no work emails confirming a reservation, nothing that pointed to a business dinner. Instead, one thing stood out: a Google Maps search for a luxury apartment complex on the other side of the city. I wanted to confront her right then and there, to demand she tell me who she was really meeting. But I held back. Not yet. If I accused her now, she would find a way to twist it, to make me seem like the insecure, overthinking husband. I needed something solid. I needed undeniable proof. So I let her go. I watched as she walked out the door, her heels clicking against the floor, leaving behind only the fading scent of her perfume. The moment I heard the car pull out of the driveway, I reached for my phone. I had one idea left, and if I was right, I was about to uncover a truth I could no longer ignore. Something inside me had shifted. This wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was certainty. I still didn't have hard evidence, nothing concrete I could hold in my hands, but I felt it. It was in the way and barely looked at me anymore, how she always seemed preoccupied even when she was sitting right next to me. It was in the hesitation before she spoke, the distant, polite tone she had started using whenever she said goodnight. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It sat heavy in my chest, pressing down on me more and more with each passing day. I wasn't sleeping well anymore. My nights were restless, spent staring at the ceiling while Anne lay beside me, her back always turned. Sometimes, I would hear the soft tap of her fingers against her phone screen, see the faint glow illuminating her face in the dark. She thought I was asleep. I let her think that. But I knew she wasn't just mindlessly scrolling, there was someone on the other end of that screen. Someone who had her attention in a way I no longer did. The emotional distance was painful enough, but the physical distance was worse. It had been weeks since she had touched me in any real way. It was always, "I'm too tired," or "not tonight, I have an early morning." At first, I believed her excuses. But now, they felt like something else, a carefully constructed barrier to keep me at arm's length while she gave herself to someone else. And then there were the late nights. The endless work meetings. The networking events. The last-minute texts about sudden changes in her schedule. Anne had always had a demanding career, but this was different. Before, she would share details, who she was meeting, what the project was about, how long she expected to be out. Now, her explanations were vague, filled with pauses and half-hearted justifications. She was lying to me. I didn't need proof to know that. I could hear it in her voice. One evening something was about to change. I had decided to test her. She had just finished getting ready for yet another so-called business dinner, and I stood in the doorway, watching as she adjusted the neckline of a dress I had never seen before. A dress that hugged her figure in just the right way. She reached for her perfume, the one she used to save for special occasions, and spritzed it along her neck. It took everything in me to keep my voice steady. "Who are you meeting?" I asked, as casually as I could. She didn't even flinch. "Just some people from work. Nothing exciting. Where's the dinner?" She glanced at her phone, then shrugged. "That little French place downtown. The one with the overpriced wine list." I nodded, pretending to accept her answer. But I didn't, not for a second. I had already checked the restaurant's reservations earlier that day. Her name wasn't on the list. Neither was her company's. She was lying to my face. I watched as she finished getting ready, every movement precise, practiced, effortless. It was second nature to her now, this performance. The act of dressing up, walking out the door, and leaving me behind without a second thought. She didn't hesitate. She didn't falter. She didn't even show the slightest trace of guilt. This was routine for her. I waited until she was gone before reaching for my phone. This time, I wasn't just going to sit around, drowning in my own thoughts, staring at the clock, waiting for her to come home with another lie. I needed to see what was really happening. I opened the tracking app we had installed on our shared car years ago. It had been her idea, back when she worried about getting stranded somewhere alone at night. She had forgotten about it. I hadn't. My pulse pounded as I watched her location update in real time. She wasn't heading downtown. She wasn't going to any restaurant. She was driving in the opposite direction, toward a part of the city we had no connection to. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe there was still an explanation. Maybe I was misreading things. Or maybe I was about to find out exactly what I had feared all along. The night I learned the truth, I wasn't even supposed to be home. That was what made it so perfect for her, so easy. She had gotten comfortable, careless even. She had convinced herself that she was in control, that her lies were working, that I was still the oblivious husband who trusted her without question. But she had underestimated me. It was late in the afternoon when I made my decision. I told my boss I wasn't feeling well, packed up my things, and walked out of the office with a strange sense of finality. Something was coming. I could feel it. The weight in my chest had grown heavier over the past few days, suffocating me, making it impossible to focus on anything else. My suspicions had consumed me, leaving me restless and on edge. I needed to know. I needed to see it with my own eyes. The drive home was eerily quiet. The city moved around me in its usual rhythm, cars honking, people crossing streets, conversations blending into the background. But it all felt distant, like I was moving through a dream, disconnected from everything except the certainty that, as if the universe itself had conspired to ensure I felt every agonizing second of this moment, I found myself trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I had pulled into our neighborhood expecting nothing more than another long night of silent doubt and unanswered questions. Instead, I was about to witness my entire world collapse before my eyes. The first thing that struck me was her car sitting in the driveway. She wasn't supposed to be home yet. That morning, she had told me she had a late meeting, another evening spent at work. But she was here. And she wasn't alone. Parked right next to her car was another vehicle, a sleek, high-end model that reeked of money and status. Too expensive. Too familiar. A sickening wave of recognition crashed over me like a freight train. I knew that car. I had seen it countless times before, pulling into the office parking lot every morning, sliding effortlessly into the reserved space closest to the entrance. My boss. For what felt like an eternity, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My own breathing filled the car, shaky, uneven, laced with the kind of dread that settles deep in your bones. I wanted to be wrong. I needed to be wrong. But I wasn't. Deep down, I had known the truth for a long time. I had just been too much of a coward to face it. I forced myself to move, stepping out of the car with slow, deliberate motions, as if dragging out the inevitable could somehow soften the blow. My heart slammed against my ribs as I approached the front door, my every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The air around me felt heavy, thick with something unseen but undeniable. I reached for the handle, turned it with fingers that barely felt like my own, and pushed the door open. And then I heard it. A low murmur. A hushed laugh. And above it all, the unmistakable, rhythmic creak of a bed upstairs. The house that had once been my refuge, my safe haven, now felt like the scene of a crime, like I was walking through the wreckage of something that had already been reduced to dust. Each step toward the stairs felt heavier than the last, my body moving forward on autopilot, driven by something primal and unstoppable. The closer I got, the clearer the sounds became. A moan. A gasp. The intimate, unmistakable cadence of betrayal. I reached the bedroom door. It was half open, swaying slightly from the movement inside. My breath hitched. I didn't hesitate. I pushed it open. And there she was. My wife. The woman I had loved. The woman I had sacrificed for. The woman I had trusted without question. In our bed. With him. They didn't see me at first. Too caught up in each other, too lost in the moment, too convinced that their perfect little secret would remain just that. And then she turned her head. Our eyes met. And in that instant, everything shattered. The room around me shrank, suffocating and oppressive. The scent of sweat, perfume, and deception clung to the air, thick and nauseating. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out every other sound. Time slowed to a crawl. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Not what it looks like, I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. Are you serious, Anne? I saw the exact moment horror replaced pleasure on her face, the way her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. My boss reacted first, jolting upright and scrambling for the sheets like some flimsy piece of fabric could erase what I had just seen. His face twisted into a mix of fear and arrogance, as if he was caught but still believed he could talk his way out of it. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there, staring at her. At him. At the wreckage of my marriage laid bare in front of me. Then the rage hit. I had always imagined that if I ever found myself in this situation, I would react with cold, calculated anger. That I would be in control. That I would handle it like a man who refused to let his emotions get the best of him. But there is no preparing for something like this. There is no rationality in watching the woman you love with another man, in your own home, on your own bed. Something inside me snapped, and in that moment I knew I wasn't just going to walk away from this. I was going to make them both pay. For a brief, suffocating moment, there was nothing but silence. The kind that presses down on you like an unbearable weight. And was frozen, her face pale, her body tangled in the sheets like a criminal caught in the act. My boss, her lover, stared at me wide-eyed, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he clutched the blanket over himself in some pathetic attempt at modesty. But there was nothing they could do to undo what I had seen. I had caught them. And now, I was going to destroy them. I took a slow step forward, my fingers curling into fists at my sides. Neither of them spoke, too stunned to react, too exposed to come up with whatever pathetic excuses they had been rehearsing for months. And was the first to move, clutching the sheet to her chest, her mouth opening and closing as if she was searching for the right words. But there weren't any. Nothing she could say would make this better. Nothing could erase the image now burned into my mind. It's not what it looks like, she finally stammered, her voice weak, trembling. I let out a sharp, cold laugh, one that tasted of bitterness and finality. Not what it looks like. My voice was eerily calm, but my hands were trembling with barely contained rage. And you're in our bed, with my boss. So tell me, what exactly does it look like? She flinched, like I had struck her. Good. She deserved worse. Then I turned my attention to him. He had always been so smug, walking around like a man who owned everything he touched. But now, he looked like a coward. Get up. My voice was low, controlled, but thick with fury. Neither of them moved. I said, get up! I roared. And jumped, and my boss scrambled out of the bed, still clutching the sheet around his waist like it could protect him from what was coming. I took another step forward, and he stumbled back, his confidence crumbling. His eyes widened with fear, not just of my anger, but of something deeper. He knew. He could see it. I wasn't just angry. I was dangerous. Put your clothes on and get the hell out of my house. I spat, my voice razor sharp. Now. Before I make you regret ever stepping foot in here. He didn't argue. He didn't even try. He just nodded, his hands shaking as he grabbed his clothes from the floor, dressing as quickly as he could. And sat frozen on the bed, her breath shallow, her eyes locked on me as if she barely recognized the man standing in front of her. Once he was dressed, I pointed to the door. Out. My voice was quiet, deadly. And if you so much as look in my direction again, I will ruin you. He didn't need to be told twice. He bolted, practically running out of the room, his expensive shoes thudding against the floor as he stumbled down the stairs. A moment later, the front door slammed shut. The sound was satisfying. But I wasn't done. I turned back to Anne. She was still sitting there, wrapped in the sheets like they could shield her from what was coming. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to speak, to beg. Pack your shit and get out. She blinked, her tear-filled eyes searching my face like she had misheard me. What? Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. You heard me, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. You don't live here anymore. You don't get to sleep in this bed. You don't get to have anything in this house. Get your things and get out. Tears spilled over her cheeks as she shook her head, her breathing ragged. Please, we can talk about this. There's nothing to talk about. My words cut through her plea like a blade. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. She hesitated, as if she still believed she could reach me. As if she thought I was still the man who had once loved her. But that man was gone. Without another word, I turned and walked away. I walked over to the closet and yanked the doors open. Everything of hers was inside, her designer clothes, her neatly organized shoes, her collection of expensive bags. All the things she had spent years curating. All the things she had bought with my money. And I wasn't letting her take any of it. I grabbed the first handful of clothes I saw and tossed them onto the floor. Then another. And another. And gasped, jumping off the bed and rushing toward me, panic in her eyes. Stop! What are you doing? She cried, reaching out to grab my arm. I shoved her hand away. Not hard, but firm enough to make her stumble back. These don't belong to you anymore, I said, my voice ice cold. Nothing in this house does. You cheated in my home. In my bed. So now you leave with nothing. She sobbed, shaking her head. Please don't do this, I made a mistake. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. A mistake? I scoffed. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is burning dinner. I took a step closer, watching her flinch. What you did? That was a choice. A choice you made over and over again. She fell silent. Her tears came harder now, but I didn't care. I grabbed a suitcase from the corner of the room, shoved a few random items inside, zipped it up, and threw it at her feet. That's all you get. Take it and leave. She stood there, trembling, staring at the suitcase as if it were a death sentence. Where am I supposed to go? She whispered. I shrugged. Not my problem. Her lip quivered, but I had no sympathy left. She had destroyed us. Now she had to deal with the consequences. I pointed to the door. Get out, Anne. And don't ever come back. She stood there for a few more seconds, waiting for something, waiting for me to change my mind, to forgive her, to tell her I still loved her. But I didn't. I just stared at her, cold and unmoving, until she finally bent down, grabbed the suitcase, and turned toward the door. She hesitated one last time, glancing back at me, her face streaked with tears. I'm sorry, she choked out. I didn't say a word. I just watched as she walked away. And when the door closed behind her, I exhaled for the first time in weeks. And was gone. And I was finally free. Throwing her out of the house should have brought me peace. It should have made me feel like I'd won. But as I stood in the silence of my now empty home, surrounded by the echoes of a marriage that no longer existed, I realized I wasn't done. Not yet. Because while Anne had been the one to betray me, my boss had made a choice too. He had looked me in the eye for years. Shaken my hand. Praised my work. Pretended to respect me, all while screwing my wife behind my back. That wasn't just disrespect. It wasn't just betrayal. It was war. And I wasn't walking away without setting fire to everything he had built. That night, still riding the high of adrenaline, I sat down at my desk and powered on my work laptop. I had spent years at that company, long enough to know every crack in its foundation, every secret tucked away. I had put in more hours than anyone, taken on the projects no one else wanted, and cleaned up the messes my boss was too incompetent to handle. And now, I was about to ensure that his entire career came crashing down under the weight of his own arrogance. The plan was simple. Before walking away, I would sabotage the company's biggest ongoing project, one that was already hanging by a thread, and turn it into a complete disaster. In just a few weeks, my boss was scheduled to present it to the board of directors, touting it as his crowning achievement. He had spent months bragging about it, acting like it was his masterpiece. Not anymore. I worked through the night, meticulously combing through every financial report, every analysis, every spreadsheet connected to the project. I adjusted formulas, skewed figures, and erased critical data, all while making sure it looked like an unfortunate case of human error, an unnoticed chain of miscalculations waiting to detonate at the worst possible moment. The beauty of it? Since I had been the one handling most of the workload, no one would even think to question the integrity of the files until it was too late. I could already envision the panic, the frantic emails, the desperate attempts to salvage what was beyond repair. And at the heart of the catastrophe? My boss, stammering, sweating, watching his so-called brilliant success disintegrate before the board's eyes. By the time morning rolled around, I walked into the office just like any other day, my expression unreadable. My coworkers greeted me, blissfully unaware that by the end of the day, the company's golden boy would be standing in the middle of a smoldering wreckage of his own making. When I stepped into his office, he was at his desk, acting as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't caught him screwing my wife in my own bed. But the way he glanced up, a little too quickly, told me he was waiting for a reaction. Bracing himself. Unsure if I was about to throw a punch or pretend I didn't know. Truthfully? I wasn't sure either. Instead, I pulled an envelope from my pocket, placed it on his desk, and sat down. His eyes flickered to it. "What's this?" he asked, his tone wary. "My resignation," I said, my voice flat. For a brief moment, he hesitated, clearly caught off guard. He wasn't expecting this. "Listen," he started, leaning forward slightly. "I know what happened was a mistake, a lapse in judgment. I lifted a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "I don't care what you have to say." My tone was steady, controlled, cold. "Just accept the resignation and move on." He studied me, waiting for me to break, to lash out, to threaten him. But I didn't. Because I had already won. He had no clue, but in just a few weeks, everything he had built was going to crumble beneath him. "Fine," he finally muttered, exhaling sharply as he signed the papers. "I'll process it today." I stood up, adjusting my jacket with a slow, deliberate motion. "Good luck with the board meeting," I said, my tone almost casual, before turning toward the door. I didn't need to glance back to know he was watching me leave, probably trying to figure out why I wasn't lashing out, why I wasn't more visibly broken. He had no idea what was coming. That was the last time I ever set foot in that office. I packed my things, walked out without a second glance, and left them all to deal with the catastrophe I had set in motion. A few weeks later, my phone buzzed with a message from an old coworker. "Dude. Boss just got obliterated in the board meeting. They found out about the project errors, and he couldn't explain any of it. They're talking about forcing him to resign." I smirked. Good. He had ripped my life apart. Now, I had returned the favor. And it felt damn good. But as I sat there, staring at the screen, waiting for some kind of deep satisfaction to wash over me, I felt nothing. No triumph. No closure. Just an empty void where anger had once been. I had been so consumed with revenge that I had never stopped to think about what came after. And was gone. My job was gone. Every piece of the life I had spent years building had been erased. And yet, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't suffocating. I wasn't lying awake at night, torturing myself with doubts, questioning if I had imagined everything, blaming myself for a marriage that had been over long before I saw the truth. The betrayal had shattered me. But in some strange, twisted way, it had also freed me. I had spent years chasing stability, clinging to a relationship that had never truly been mine, sacrificing for a woman who had never valued what we had. And for what? A house that felt more like a prison? A career that drained the life out of me? A marriage built on deception? No. I was done. In the weeks that followed, I cut ties completely. I ignored Anne's texts, pleas for forgiveness, desperate apologies, empty words meant to pull me back into the wreckage she had created. She had made her choice. And I had made mine. My ex-boss, on the other hand, was too busy scrambling to save himself to reach out. But it was useless. The fallout had been swift. The board had uncovered the financial disaster, the company had lost millions, and they needed a scapegoat. Since he had spent years taking credit for my work, he had no one to back him up when it mattered most. They forced him to resign. Poetic justice. But as much as I had wanted to revel in the victory, I realized something: none of it mattered anymore. I didn't need to check on Anne. I didn't need to care if my ex-boss landed on his feet. Their stories weren't mine to follow anymore. So I let go. I moved out of the house, listed it for sale, and walked away from a place that held nothing but ghosts. For so long, I had fought to hold on, to a marriage, to a job, to a life that had been slipping away for years. But in the end, letting go was the real victory. So I booked a one-way ticket to somewhere I had never been. Somewhere far. Somewhere new. Somewhere untouched by the past I no longer wanted to carry. And as I sat on that plane, watching the city shrink beneath me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Because this wasn't running away. This was finally moving forward,